This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Does that work? Is that working? That's working. All right. Cool bananas. Oh, we've started. Let's get going. So we're gonna finish off half of the lecture that we didn't finish yesterday because I got a bit too enthused and included too many case studies. And then we're gonna talk about the ethics of hype, which means the reimbursement kind of fell off the radar. So I was gonna spend a couple of slides talking about issues with reimbursement. But then I realized that this is not a business course. And if you guys ever get to that point, you can sort it out yourselves. Where you're worrying about how you're going to get paid for your medical device. And if not, you can get a consultant. So needless to say, reimbursement can be an issue, but you can figure it out. So let's stick to the stuff that actually matters for the description of this course, or just stuff that I generally find interesting. All right, registries. Oh, and thanks to everyone who emailed me. I will post the slides from the workshop, even though I didn't want to. So they'll go up online today. Okay. Right, so we're still at the very, very end of the life cycle of the medical device. Doesn't it feel good to have it all done? So we're looking at post-market studies and surveillance. So yesterday we were talking about all the stuff, was it yesterday? It was yesterday. That can go wrong after you pass everything. You get it onto the market, and then a little bit down the road you find out that stuff doesn't work out as well as you thought it would in the room. So if you're obviously legally required to have ongoing surveillance and submit reports to the TGA, but if you weren't, you do want to have, and as part of your risk management, some sort of mechanism in place to capture all that data that's coming your way. So today's lecture is going to be about medical device registries. What are they? How do they work? We're going to talk about the Australian National Joint Registry. We're going to talk about the new, it's going to get introduced later this year, Unique Device Identifier Program that the TGA is bringing in, and the ethics of hype, my favorite subject. So over here, that image is actually one of the original tracheal implants. So this is before the reabsorbable one that was done in the baby. This is a plastic composite one that was 3D printed, and they used the patient's own stem cells. And that behind them is supposedly a bioreactor. So they were treated in a bioreactor before being put back into people, but we'll talk about those later. So what is a patient registry? Okay, so there's a couple of definitions, but it's an organized system that collects data and analyzes it in order to improve patient outcomes, pretty much, I think. That's what it says. So it's an observational study. It tries to collect lots of data, and it wants uniform data. And it looks at very specific outcomes for a population. So it can be a particular disease condition, or in our case, a particular type of intervention. So if they get a particular hit, they fall into that group and they get followed and they get registered within their patient registry. So why do we do this? Because as we were discussing last week, there is power in big data. It actually tells us a lot of information that doing case studies on individual patients can't, and it tells us a lot of information that limited clinical studies can't. So having access to this and having the statistical confidence and means to analyze it will actually change how we do medicine in the future, and it's changing how we do medicine today. So how do registries actually work? So this is just the bariatric surgery registry. I just used it as an example because it had a really nice diagram, which I liked. I like diagrams. So now this is not a national registry, and it's not compulsory, but they get data from surgeons, from hospitals, and from patients. Then they verify it against internal systems, so they check for accuracy. They do data integrity checks, and sometimes they verify it against a third party. So they might get told that a particular type of implant was used, and then they might actually go to the manufacturer and say, we have a batch number, or we have a just confirm that that's a particular model that was used, something like that. Then they analyze and report data. So there's an annual population report that comes out. There's an individual surgeon report. Yes, they can do those. There's hospital group reports for a particular hospital, so you can look at your own mortality. And you can look at your own success rates for a particular procedure as per hospital. Some of this is not necessarily publicly released, so it might just be released to the college that's running the database. And then they actually get released to the device manufacturer as well. So that's pretty useful, right? That's probably because they want the device manufacturer to pay. Often you have to subscribe and pay a certain amount of money to have access to this information. Not all of it is available to the public, but some of it is. So the outcomes that they generally tend to measure is mortality, adverse event rate, and reoperation rate. So especially for bariatric surgery, this is what we want. So you would find clinically significant outcomes that we look at. So that was what's measured, but what you're hoping to achieve in red, the subsequent clinical data, is weight loss and change in diabetes treatment. So these are some of the people that can undergo bariatric surgery under Medicare. So they look at Medicare item numbers. Normally, if you want bariatric surgery, unless you're either so morbidly obese or you have type 2 or type 1 diabetes, you're going to have to pay for it privately. So, all right, so those are the outcome measures. So have a think about how you would put this data together for your device. All right, so the shining, glittering jewel of success in Australia, and this has been identified, everyone goes on about this. Other countries go on about how amazing the Australian National Joint Replacement Registry is. So it's a compulsory registry for orthopedic surgery. It is done all over Australia, so every single orthopedic surgeon practicing in any hospital in Australia has to report this data. And it works really well. So it's been around for a while, and there's been lots of Senate reports and government reports and other reports that just talk about how amazing this registry is, and in reality it's actually pretty good. So it's funded by the Australian government, but there is a cost recovery section for this registry from industry. So I actually looked at the legal documents that they use to do cost recovery, and they get it from the medical devices listed for use in private hospitals. So they have to pay a small fee for every device listed. So some of that money is actually used to fund the National Joint Registry. So what it does, it collects data on approximately 560 different types of joint replacement devices, such as hip, knee, shoulder, elbow, wrist, ankle, and spinal disc replacements from all Australian hospitals. It monitors and has information so far on over 1.1 million joint replacement operations. So that's a lot of information. That's a huge data set, and you can mine that for all kinds of things. De-identified. So it provides annual reports on both the clinical performance of those devices, including revision rates, complications, and other items. So it provides this data per device. So it gives you beautiful, clear graphs. So it makes it really, really easy to make informed clinical decision making. So if you, for example, there might be 4 different brands of knees, and you are trained in putting all 4 of those knees in, but you have 2 favorites that you find easiest to work with because you're most familiar with them. Then you look at this data and you find that with one of those joints, the rates of revision are much higher, or 20% higher than with the other one. That makes your decision for you. So obviously you're going to use whatever joint is the most clinically appropriate for your patient, but when they both are, this really helps narrow down and choose the safest procedure possible. So it provides additional detailed analysis of all prostheses identified as having a higher than anticipated rate of revision. So if a red flag pops up or something changes, or they find that there is a significant difference between 2 types of identical joints, I say identical, I just mean in terms of 2 different models of the same joint, they initiate and follow through a detailed analysis on why there is a difference, what's the actual difference, and then make a recommendation on outcome. So when they're sufficiently funded and when they're operated effectively, they improve the value of healthcare delivery at relatively low cost. So they're super efficient at doing this. By increasing availability and use of process and outcomes data, they deliver strong economic returns on investment. I thought I included this in here. So the rate of return, they've done a cost-benefit analysis of the MJR, and it was 5 to 1 benefit cost. So for every dollar spent on running the MJR, the government saves about 5, and in some reports up to $7. So that's, when you're talking about millions of dollars and lots of procedures being done, that's huge. Not to mention improved outcomes for patients. So over time, Australia experienced a decline in the burden of revision in hip and knee arthroplasty. The revision rate has actually increased in other countries, such as the US, which doesn't have a full national registry, and the UK, which only has a limited national registry. So Australia avoided a similar increase and experienced a reduction in the revision burden. If the reduction alone were attributed to the MJR, it's equivalent to a benefit of $618 million over 15 years. So that's a lot of millions of dollars. All right, so a lot of patients were helped by this. So if we look at equivalent countries, just by having this registry, you can straight away see a big difference. All right, so they monitor safety. They do all of these different activities to improve standards and cost savings. What else did I put in there? If you guys have time, have a look at one of their reports online. I think they publish a lot of their reports. It's really interesting reading. So surgeons are able to compare and use the type and class of prosthesis shown to have better outcomes. And they can abandon the use of those devices where the performance data is not as good. So overall, statistically, hip replacement revision went from 12% down to 8.9, so 9%. And knee replacement went down by about 1.5%. So you think a couple of percent, not a big deal, but when we're talking about 50,000 procedures for knees alone, that's a lot of hundreds of patients. So under the current funding arrangement, it costs about just a little, it's about $2.5 million to run per year. But as I said, there's the cost-benefit ratio. It has a 5 to 1 cost-benefit ratio. So they're saving about $7.5 million a year. Wait, 2 times 5, so $10 million a year. Basic maths has abandoned me today. Anyhow, so we still have a huge way to go. So the MJR is amazing, great. What about all the other registries? So we were talking about breast implants yesterday. There was a vague breast implant registry, but it was abandoned because nobody wanted to pay for it and very few people wanted to run it. Then we have the Australian Society of Plastic Surgeons that sort of run an Australian breast device registry. However, it's voluntary, and they recommend that the patient themselves ask the doctor to enter their breast implant on this registry. So it's not, not a lot of doctors bother putting it in because it's a lot of paperwork, it's a lot of time, and they don't get paid to do it, and they don't have to do it. So there's the thing. If you're legally required to do it, then you will do it. If you're not, and you're a busy surgeon trying to find time, each half an hour that you lose is probably another surgery you could have done. So when people don't actually put information in there, there's very limited data that you can get out of it. As someone said, garbage in, garbage out. Right. Plus, plastic surgery is not as regulated in Australia as it could be. So you will notice that it's not run by the Australian College of Surgery. So that's a bit of an issue too. All right. So the future in terms of registries is, thanks to our registry, we actually had a heads up on the metal-on-metal hip prosthesis issue before anyone else did. So, and to date, they've identified and in some cases removed from the market information that they've provided has led to the removal from market more than 150 poorly performing joint replacement products. So that's huge. So India is in the process of creating its own joint replacement registry modeled on the Australian version. Also Finland, Norway, UK, and I think Canada. The US, last year they announced that they're developing a mega joint registry, but it's only for veterans because that's who they have the most data on, and it's the easiest for them to collect because it's run under a different scheme. But there is a lot of veterans in the US, so veterans and their families get their health paid for by the American government. Australia is currently implementing a unique device identifier program. So this means that it's like a registry where you record the device identifier of what you put into a person. This is in response to the Senate inquiry into the surgical mesh where people had no idea what was in who. So they're saying we need something better than that. We need to have this data in one place that's accessible. And we need to make everyone put their data in there. So they have implemented a thing where you're required to give your patient like an information card with what product was put in there and what the barcode, whatever is, that they take with them after the surgery so they can keep an eye on it. But obviously patients are not going to hold on to that for very long. But this is a much better way of doing it, and it's been recommended as an international type of thing. And we're looking at globally harmonizing unique device identifiers, so across the globe. So that was the consultation. It's proposed for 2023. So it's going to start off with just in Australia, but they want to actually link it to the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. So if something's listed on the therapeutic goods, you can just follow it in and you can directly see how many were implanted, and if you needed to track it back, you can find out. But we need to introduce specific legislation for this to happen, and that takes time. So the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, the IMDRF, which is the leading body for regulation, global regulation, have recently released a whole bunch of really useful documents that governments can then copy and introduce into their own legislation. But they get together, this is all the regulators. And if you have a look, just this year, it must be a hot topic. So principles for labeling for medical devices and IVD devices, use of unique device identifier data elements across different jurisdictions. So this is all really helpful stuff, and this is what they do best. All right. So registries, why do we need them? At the end of the day, they improve clinical practice. So you have lots of different things that you can go to in order for you to improve your practice. However, first of all, you have to be aware of the fact that you're doing something wrong. Right? The fact that you're just recording your outcomes makes you a better surgeon. So, hospitals have the M&M warnings, the morbidity and mortality, where you have to get up and talk about how many of your patients died in front of your colleagues and discuss what the issues related to that particular incident were. Those things do amazingly well in terms of just helping that surgeon then go on to make different decisions and choices the wrong way around. Even if you don't, not that we want to shame them into anything, but even if you don't change your approach, just being aware of your stats is a really good idea. So, exception reporting, individual feedback, clinical feedback, and public reporting all help with clinical practice. And surgeons will go out of their way to find out whether the treatment that they're providing is the absolute best that they can do for that particular patient at any given time. All right. So the idea is to have this self-improving, multifaceted healthcare system, which always leads to better outcomes and better value for the patient. So that's why we do what we do. That's why we have the regulation. That's why we have the registries. That's why we have all these conditions. That's why we make him run through all these loops in order to get onto the market. That's why we regulate clinical trials and we have best practice for clinical trials. And that's why we have healthcare practice, policy, and stewardship in general, is to get better outcomes for patients. At the end of the day, that's the goal. It's not about, ideally, it's not about making money. It's not about being successful and having the biggest market share. It's about improving quality of life and solving a problem. Okay, the World Health Organization envisions this with having competent authorities, having both a user reporting system and a medical device vigilance system and a post-marketing surveillance working together. And it all being contained in one giant suppository of data and mining that for outcomes. So what they mean is, I thought this was pretty good. We were talking about cloud platforms and that sort of stuff. So they were saying, we can use that. We can use this new technology to give us everything that we need. So you can take all the data coming from a hospital. You can take data from inventory. You can then take, you can do data mining from all of these different countries and all of these different systems. and you can create a database, throw it all together, analyze it, and come up with a detection engine that will tell you what's safe. So this is the Medical Device Innovation Consortium, and they've been producing useful documents since 2011. They only got together recently, and they work with the IMDRF. It's like a subsection of the IMDRF. And yeah, they get together and they talk about the future, and they say, wouldn't it be nice if we did this? And then they write like a specific document that will help governments adopt that as best practice. So they have an international consortium of orthopedic registries, and Australia is a part of this, and they want to advance the research and improve evidence for the safety and effectiveness of orthopedic devices. Strategic plans, harmonizing the data, implementing, distributing. They're looking at coordinating and bringing together all of these different registries currently doing their own thing. So there's a special registry for freaking everything, and obviously there's not enough of them. Because you read a lot of these coroner reports, I don't know about you guys, but sometimes I read coroner reports of surgeries that have gone wrong. And a lot of the time, the coroner says, you know, almost always, one of the outcomes is improved education to either patient or surgeon. Like improved information so they can make better decisions, because a lot of the time inappropriate treatment gets prescribed and then that patient dies. And improvement availability of outcome data such as a registry. So in some coroner reports, they actually say we need a registry for this particular type of device. So one of the bariatric devices, so they pretty much said that the registry that was there that I showed you is not as effective as it could be. And if they'd consulted it, they would have seen that that particular procedure was inappropriate for that patient. Anyways, long story short, we want to get all of this together and have one massive international coordinated registry network. So they want to take existing national registries, such as the NJR, and have a coordinating center, and get some useful data out of it. So they were talking about aggregating findings, writing and distributing code, and supporting registry leads. And they want it to look something like this. Right? It looks complicated, but it isn't. So they just want everyone to input their thing, use a machine-based learning and cloud platform, and it would not only give you results, but it would do like a basic analysis and tell you exactly how to improve, so that in the end you can end up with a much better survival model than we currently have. And you can do this not just for joints, that's like the low-hanging fruit. You can do this for any type of procedure or device, if you had enough data. Any questions on that? No? Okay, so yeah, registry is good. But then you think about, well, how am I going to create a registry? What am I going to measure if we're doing like completely customized devices? If we're 3D printing everything, which means you do it slightly differently for each patient, what do you report on? How do you measure an outcome on something that's custom made? So those are the questions. How much data would you actually need for it to be useful? But the idea is, if you set it up now and you start collecting that data now, by the time you need the outcome of that data, there will hopefully be enough for it to give you a statistically relevant result. You don't want to wait until it's accepted as everyday treatment and then start to try and set up a registry. So anyhow, that's just my 5 cents. Now, we talked about ethics. We talked about innovation. We talked about all these new wonderful things that are coming. So let's talk about the ethics of hype. Who has seen the Gartner hype cycle before? Nobody. That's all right. The gist of it is that we as humans are famously bad at predicting the future of technologies. We just are. There's lots of case studies, but we're terrible at this. We tend to overestimate technology at the early stage and then underestimate it at the later stages. And this is a famous hype cycle curve, which sort of talks about it. So we have the expectations, we have the innovation trigger, so something happens. Then it goes all the way up to like peak expectation, and then you get disillusioned with that particular technology, and then slowly you have a slope of enlightenment where So it's got a lot to do with like public excitement, media, how new technology is perceived. So for example, the innovation triggers would be the 3D home 3D printers coming out. And people were like, oh man, I was one of those people. I want one of those. I can like throw out all of my like, I don't know, car tools. I can print my own replacement parts. I can do this, I can do that. And then you like buy your like overly expensive, you know, couple of $1,000 printer and some substrate. And all you end up doing with it is like some Star Wars themed mugs that you can't even put in the microwave because they're made out of plastic. So, you know, and if you have teenagers in the house, inadvertently, they just like 3D print certain objects. Yeah. So that's the peak. You're like, yeah, this is going to be great. It's going to revolutionize what I need to keep around the home. I can do all this stuff, and then you crash and burn, and then slowly you go, oh, maybe it is actually useful, but only for a certain application. But then you get to the point where you go, oh, I never really thought of that, when it starts being used for a particular application, and then it gets extrapolated on. Let me see if I've got a better one. So yes, you have a technology trigger. So people get excited about the hypothetical applications. Yeah, my Yoda mug. And they say, oh, we can do this, we can do that, we can 3D print organs, we can do all this stuff. And then you have a case where like someone does it and the patient dies, and you go, oh, well, that failed spectacularly. And then slowly, there's the slope of enlightenment, and we start to see rapid advancements that surpass expectation. But by then, we're not even looking. And finally, when the technology becomes more mature, we find that it does really well. There's lots of revenue generated, and we start to take that product for granted. We don't even notice it anymore. You just accept it as part of everyday treatment. So I was actually trying to find this scale applied to like stuff that's relevant to us, and I think this was the last one. It's more like digital health, and it's looking at cloud computing and that sort of stuff, and diagnostics. But you can see at which different stages of this curve a lot of this technology is. So if we have a look at it, they've put non-invasive glucose monitoring at the technology trigger. So you know how I was talking about people MacGyvering their like little glucose monitors and stuff? Yeah. So deep learning, brain-to-computer interfaces, ingestible sensors. I know some of you guys are doing that for your project. And then we're at the very, very high peak stuff of artificial intelligence symptom checkers, whatever that means. Non-invasive imaging, persuasive architecture, diagnostics, that sort of stuff. And then, the Google glasses, they were the big thing, and then they sort of disappeared, right? Well, they have some health applications, so watch this space. And finally, stuff like precision medicine, remote consultations that were really big in their heyday, and people were saying, oh, you can't get a decent connection, you can't do this, you can't do that. They're actually happening right now. They're reaching patients in remote areas, so they actually have specialist access with some of this technology. There's blockchain, there's voice technology, there's telehealth, although I have issues with the current e-health system that they've set up, but that's beside the point. Personal health assistance, remote monitoring, and wearable technology is finally like hitting the market and making a difference for people. So I thought that was interesting. So where do you think your device would sit on this scale? Somewhere near that front bottom. And this was just all of emerging technologies for 28. They update this diagram every year at the Gartner, at one of the, it gets published every year. And I just thought, if you look at the very, very, very bottom of that curve, it says biotech culture of artificial tissue. It's at the very bottom. And then if you sort of scroll up, you're going to see some other, like 4D printing and human augmentation is only starting to climb the curve. So I thought that was pretty cool. Yeah, it's interesting. And self-driving cars are like on the other side of it. Can you find them? You get the idea. So let's move on. Is trends. So along with updating this curve, they always sort of give you the trends. So they analyze huge amounts of data and then try to figure out where everything's going. And I actually kind of agree with some of this, that it is the future. And I can see a lot of work being done in that space. So artificial intelligence, we were talking about that in the guest lecture. But do-it-yourself biohacking. So it's not new. It's been around for a while. It's really taken off in the last 10 years. So we're talking about biochips, biotech. I've looked at research in IVF, where they're producing these biochips that will regulate the growth of the embryo, so you don't have to like keep changing all the media and all of that stuff. Exoskeleton stuff, augmented reality, mixed reality, smart fabrics is the other big one. There's all kinds of different stuff that they can look at, but I think that using medical device to extend humans and their functions is a big thing, and there's a lot of stuff coming in that space. I don't know. Watch this space. So even today, we are using systems every day that are of a level of complexity. Complex systems. We use them, we just presume that someone has done the hard work for us. We use them without needing to understand them and wanting to understand them. And what we were saying before, we use artificial intelligence every day, but do we actually know how they arrived at their conclusion? Before the lecture we had yesterday, no, we didn't. So what I'm saying is you can have incredibly complex medical devices, but you have to do your due diligence because the user is not going to. So. All right. This is a good case study, I felt, because we were talking about one example of having a 3D printed trachea for a specific patient that worked really well. So, but before that, this happened. I like this paper because I know Gilbert, the person who wrote it, and we were talking about, he did an analysis of media articles released in a certain period of time, and he broke it down and he looked at whether this particular technology was portrayed as positive or negative, whether they even talked about ethics. So he found that despite the fact that the outcomes are currently poor for this technology, the reporting was overwhelmingly positive. So in 86% of cases, it was like an exclusively positive portrayal of the technology. And it was to do with the way that mass media took this technology and then ran with it. There was a really, really scary amount of lack of regulation and absence of discussion regarding the risk of harms. So most often than not, a lot of the papers and a lot of the media didn't even talk about the risk of harm for these patients. And he went on about shared scientific and journalistic responsibility. But you will notice that very few have a patient story. They love patient stories because there's very few patients to go around. So when you can manage to get one, they become like little celebrities in their own circle. Right? Who knows who this guy is? He's a super world famous surgeon. Alright, that's alright. Paolo Macchiarani, I think his name is. And he was super famous for a while in certain circles. And he was an amazing surgeon who could give interviews in 3 different languages. He was very competent. He worked at some of the very top hospitals, came with like a amazing pedigree in regenerative medicine. All right, and some of his academic research has now been withdrawn. Is seen as misleading, and most of his patients died. What happened? So, I'm just going to look at this particular case. So, in 2011, this 36-year-old PhD student, so he was diagnosed with a tumor of the trachea. So we were talking about if you have a soft trachea, it's not hard enough, it ends up being really floppy, and then you don't have a patent airway, you get more infections, so you actually need it to stay open. What happens when, as an adult, you get cancer in that area and they have to remove a part of your trachea, you end up with the same sort of thing, but they have nothing to replace it with. So we don't have a proper biomaterial to replace it with. Often after the tumor resection, if you're young enough, if they can find a match, you might get a donor transplant. So you might get someone else's trachea put in, and then you have to go on immunosuppressants. Right. So with the child, the trachea will eventually harden by itself and create a patent airway. With an adult, it won't. And more often than not, these tumors are almost always terminal. So once they remove the trachea, you end up with like severe infection, inflammation, not being able to cough, not being able to get rid of exudate, and they can like put in piping and suck it, all kinds of things, but it doesn't solve the problem. So this gentleman, Bain, I'm going to call him Bain. He was the first patient. He's he wasn't Indian. He was from one of those countries, like small African countries. He was in Belgium doing his PhD thesis, and he was a dad, and he was diagnosed with a tumor. They operated on him, they took it out, and a few years later it just came back bigger and worse. So he needed a much bigger surgery, and the treatments that should have been offered at that point were palliative. So to reduce the tumor as much as possible and buy him as much time as possible. So he was essentially a terminal patient. So he was referred to this particular surgeon. So he did the very, very first tailor-made stem cell seeded implant for trachea. So he used a type of 3D printed plastic. He seeded it with the patient's own stem cells, grew it in a bioreactor, popped it in, and he said, oh man, this is great. It worked really well. And I don't know if you guys know much about publishing, but the Lancet is a really, really big deal. So based off of this guy's reputation alone, the center where he did this is actually the center where the ethics committee decides who is going to win the Nobel Prize for Medicine. So it's like a really famous, what was it called? I have the name later, doesn't matter. So, you know, it's a really big hospital, really big research center, really big reputation. So a Lancet in the article came out talking about how successful this operation was. He said that, you know, he took a patient that was, you know, had less than 6 months left to live, according to him, and that's the surgeon shaking his hand on the right, and he saved him. And then after this was published, so that lent a lot of credibility to what he did. He had, you know, patients begging him to do the treatment on them. He had patients begging to go into the trial, because this is terminally ill people that we're talking about. He had doctors ringing and begging to be able to refer their patients onto him, because they didn't have any other options they could offer them at that point, other than palliative care. So he became a celebrity. He did a lot of interviews. He was actually famous before he even started this project. He liked having journalists coming and sitting in on his operations. He let them have unferreted access to his records, which then came back to bite him later. But anyways, he was a celebrity. He was very charismatic. He was very well spoken, and he was actually, for all intents and purposes, a very, very good surgeon. But he was really ambitious, and he wanted to be at the forefront of this technology. He thought he could do it, and he was really confident. So the New York Times interviewed him, and this is a quote. So he was saying, 15 months after the operation, Mr. Bain is tumor-free, breathing normally, and he also said that he'd been discharged from the other patient, so he operated on 3 more at that center. There was one that someone else operated on in London, so they were using his techniques, and a few more in Russia. So he was saying that they're all being discharged, they're all doing well. He self-reported the outcomes. And he said nothing was wrong, where in fact that wasn't the case. So by this point, he had overwhelming evidence that these patients weren't doing so well. So what happened was the material that he used, so the plastic, just like putting anything else into the body, it didn't biointegrate. So he used a type of material that was not biocompatible. So there was no integration between soft tissues and the implant that he put in. It was like hard plastic. So even though it had stem cells in it, unless you have a way to stimulate the stem cells or capture them, they will like get washed away by the circulation. I don't know if that's what happened, but so the implants were shifting. They were causing inflammation. They were actually, in some instances, compressing on the esophagus so that person couldn't eat. Around the edges, there was tearing, there was leakage, there were all kinds of problems with them. So they were like, and the body was having a reaction to them. So it caused irritation, inflammation, swelling, and it caused the body to attack the actual implant. So it caused constriction of the airways, and his patient, who had to like come up and be interviewed, he loved being interviewed too, said that he was doing really well, when in fact he was actually having recurrent infections. And he ended up having to have a whole series of stents put in to hold his airway open. Right. So there was fraud in the way that this was reported. And in his clinical notes, they do gastroscopy, and they'd say, oh, the airways look good, when in fact they didn't. But the doctor writes a report on what the airways look like, and it's his decision, it's his responsibility to describe and how accurate that description is. And he wrote that they looked really good, when in fact there was there was inflammation, there was scarring, and there was a fistula at one point, which means like it was like open, there was an opening at the bottom. Anyhow, so what went wrong? Later, there was an independent investigation after a whole bunch of people died at the Karolinska Institute. That's the name of the institute. There was loads of ethical violations. Pretty much he was so keen to get this done, he didn't bother with ethics approval. He said, I have it, and just did the surgery. Because the patient was going to die and needed it immediately. There was scientific misconduct and there was fraud. There was issues with the reporting, there was issues with the data, there was all kinds of stuff. The most important, which was he never actually tested his scaffold on animals. So he used his patient as a guinea pig. He exaggerated the condition of his patient, so had that dude been offered palliative care, he in fact would have had a reasonable quality of life for a number of years. So there was stuff that could be done. He wasn't at death's door. While he had a terminal diagnosis, he wasn't necessarily a terminal patient at that moment. And not only was he not offered alternative treatments, he had his referring doctor remove it from his file. So the investigation later confirmed that. All right, the final conclusion was there was no proper informed consent process. Nothing was recorded. They just chatted to the patient. So he was looking for someone to do this procedure on, and that was the lucky winner. So yeah, they subsequently filed a police report against the university for violating the Medicinal Products Act and the Health and Social Care. They filed a police report against the Ethical Review Act. And there was some talk about charging him criminally for assault because he didn't have consent to perform the procedures that he did. I don't know what happened with that. So this is a summary of what happened. So his first patient died 2.5 years after the operation. And the only patient that survived were the patients that had his implant removed. And they were then replaced with a donor trachea. So the ethics issues are, when he was talking to this patient later, the patient gave an interview and he said, I wasn't aware that there were other treatments available, nothing was ever discussed. He only said to me, do you want to see your patients grow up, and do you want to see your kids grow up? Right? That's what, like, you don't use that sort of emotive language, it's totally inappropriate. He never requested any ethics approval, even though he said he did. He told his patients in the scientific community that he had done animal testing in Russia and that the studies were on their way to being published in various journals. So that was blatantly untrue. There was after he was treated, after the surgery, they discontinued care for this particular man and a lot of his other patients. When he had complications, he had to chase them. Not only that, he never released a clinical trial protocol or a summary of what was done. So even when he went to other specialists, they didn't want to touch him because they didn't know what procedure was done and how it was done. So There was no clinical continuity of care. They only called him when an interview was required or when they were chasing up some information for the Lancet journal. That's the only time they called him back for imaging and other follow-up. And yeah, he died slowly suffocating on the collapsing and rotting plastic graft. So he had a horrible death, this poor man. And when he died, the surgeon was still claiming that the patient had originally no more than 6 months left to live and that his plastic trachea helped him. And the subsequent investigation proved that that wasn't the case. Not only that, but it proved that the tumor that he extracted was a lot smaller than described. He said the tumor was the size of a golf ball when it wasn't. So that's questionable as well. And his autopsy revealed that the synthetic trachea had come loose. Big surprise. One of his other patients didn't even have an autopsy. And so the other patients that died, it was actually caused by the trachea. So it was later established that he'd been trying to get this procedure through the FDA for some time and couldn't because they wouldn't approve it. He had a patient picked out, a little girl named Hannah Warren, and he pushed and pushed and pushed, and when the FDA kept refusing permission, he did his own thing with this other patient. So if someone's refusing you permission to do a particular procedure, there's usually a reason for that. And he blatantly lied. He was so caught up in the hype and the celebrity and the future of this technology, and there is a future for it, that he blatantly lied to reporters, to the scientific community, and to anyone that he would listen. Right. He lied at conferences, he presented data as fact when it was anything but. And he said, oh, I remember, and in the end, it was a journalist that followed him for the day that said, oh, there's something suspicious about this, because he said, oh, the trachea is normal. And the journalist, because he wasn't a scientific person, he was a journalist, he'd actually looked at what normal tracheas are supposed to look like, right? He'd Googled it. He'd seen a video of a gastroscopy of a normal tracheal tube. And then he actually viewed the footage of the procedure that the guy was doing. He was saying, that doesn't look right, right? There was an incident of one whistleblower that said these procedures are not kosher, they're not, they're not appropriately done, and he was booted out of the institute. Nobody wanted to hear him. He lost his job. It was only later, after the fact, when the media exploded, that he came through and he said, I lost my job because I said he was doing stuff that was inappropriate. So anyhow, so this journalist that was there to follow him for the day, in the end, he wrote the article that exposed stuff. So he took the video of the procedure and he took it to another specialist and he said, does this look normal to you? And the dude was like, yeah, nah, that's not normal. That is a very sick man right there. So that's what happened. So in the end, he said, oh, we did all these animal studies in Russia, and a reporter actually said to him, well, I looked up all the registers, because you have to register a study, in Russia, and there was nothing there. And then he said, oh, well, we didn't do any, so this is a direct quote, we didn't do any animal study that involves large animals, but we didn't have the time, right? So that was his excuse. And he said the material was proven, the material was studied. We used fibers that were approved by the FDA, and now all the studies are coming. So he was saying, oh, these were approved. I'm like, yeah, they were approved for completely different uses, like that were much lower risk than what he was doing with them. Anyhow. So in the end, the professor of surgery at the University of Gothenburg, and he used to sit in the Swedish Ethics Council, said because the same ethics committee that he operated under was the committee that decides who wins the Nobel Prize for medicine, he actually called for the Nobel Prize for medicine to be suspended for 2 years. But it wasn't, and a lot of people lost their reputations and lost their jobs and no longer sit on this committee because they were involved with the project. And the worst part is it didn't become public until there was a TV program about it, until like the newspaper published it, and then there was like a big media storm about it. So that was the only time it became visible, whereas before that there had been people raising issues about the care of these patients and about how the so-called clinical trials were done, and they were fired. So he said the failure to do preclinical tests on animals was the worst crime you can commit. So we keep talking about experimental surgeries, and we keep talking about the integrity of clinical trials, and this is what happens when you don't have that. And this was like 10 years ago. It wasn't, it wasn't 50 years ago. It's when we actually already had established practices in place to prevent this sort of stuff from happening. Questions, comments? No? Anyways, quality and safety, very important. Take it with you. If you take anything from this unit, take that with you. You cannot underestimate, like everything else you can fix, that sort of stuff, it's really hard to fix later. So, all right. Awesome, it's been a pleasure, guys. I will hopefully see you on Thursday and we can talk about the exam, and Lee's going to be here too to have a chat about her section of it. And I might see some of you in the workshop. I couldn't resist. I had to throw that last case in there, but because it just like makes me cringe every time, and I thought you guys would have heard of it.